Hello and welcome to Talking Beats. This is the first of a chat lecture series from the European Beat Studies Network. I'm Benjamin J. Heel. I'm a beat scholar and musician. I'm a board member of the EBSN and the current webmaster. Okay, so today's chat is titled Battle Instructions, William S. Burroughs at 110, and it features Alex Wermer-Colan in conversation with EBSN president and eminent beat and Burroughs scholar Oliver Harris. This open-ended chat focuses on Oliver's scholarship primarily and what brought him to study Burroughs in the first place, while also considering the ongoing contemporary relevance of William Burroughs' work. Attendees also engage in a short Q&A at the end of the chat, and do stick around and listen to that at the end as well. Do please like and subscribe this video or podcast, however you're accessing this content. And if you do have an interest in the beat more widely, do have a look at www.ebsn.eu, our website, and join as a member. And if you're feeling generous, you can consider giving us a donation so that we can keep this our non-profit organization going. It is free to join. You don't have to pay anything to join up, and you will receive regular newsletters in your inbox, and we'll keep you appraised of our activities, all the various scholarships that we put up on the website, and give you information about our conferences, our annual conferences. So this year's conference is in Białystok in Poland in mid-May, so you can check out the website to find more about that, how you can access that conference. And hopefully there'll be a new episode of Talking Beats coming soon, featuring myself in conversation with the EBSN Vice President, Paulina McKay, in conversation about her recent book, Beat Feminisms. There are other episodes forthcoming. I've also recorded a couple of other separate podcast episodes where I'm in conversation with other beat scholars, EBSN members, talking to them about their connection with the beat. Anyway, enough about this. Let's get going and enjoy Talking Beats episode 1. Well, I'm not going to introduce our primary speaker tonight, Oliver Harris, who some of you may well know fairly well. I'll allow Oliver's biography to take shape throughout the talk, but I will introduce Alex. So I'm going to be reading this out here, and I've already had a look. There are several tongue twisters that I'm going to get myself twisted up in, Alex, but give me the benefit of the doubt here as I go through. Alex Wermer-Colan is the interim academic director and digital scholarship coordinator of Temple University Library's Loretta C. Duckworth Scholars Studio. His doctoral research at the City University of New York's Graduate Center focused on the politics of decadent literature from Baudelaire to Burroughs. Alex has published wide-ranging scholarship on Burroughs' works and archive, including essays in 20th century literature, Ill Will, the American Book Review, T.H. Lawrence Review, and a variety of book publications, including an essay in the excellent recent collection Burroughs Unbound. After extensive archival research in 2015, Alex edited a collection of unpublished archival materials involving Burroughs and his experiments with cutting up other writers from Rimbaud to Anthony Burgess, titled The Travel Agency is on Fire, which was published by Lost and Found. I think there's copies still available. Is that right, Alex?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, excellent. So these texts were later set to music and performed in New York City at the Stone. Alex's dramaturgical work has led to his work on Decoder, a multimedia adaptation of Burroughs' cut-up novels to the stage, which have been performed in various venues. He also co-edited the also excellent Cutting Up the Century, a collection of essays and really, really great full-color archival materials published. And that was published by Indiana University Press and covered the range of approaches to Burroughs' cut-up method. He's currently working on a variety of Burroughs projects, including remediating underexplored elements of Burroughs' archive and adapting additional texts for musical and theatrical performance. He's also, and I know this because I'm hopefully going to be part of this too, he's co-editing with Oliver Harris and Davis Schneiderman the new collection of essays, William S. Burroughs in Context, which is going to be coming out on Cambridge University Press 2025, I think we're looking at, hopefully. So that's Alex Wermer-Colan, and I'll let Alex and Oliver, it's over to you.
Thank you, Ben.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see and have you all present. I am calling in from Philadelphia, where it is a warm and sunny afternoon. I hope you're all, some of you are up late, so thank you for joining us. And I think this will be a really interesting conversation. It means a lot to me. Just to start us off, Oliver has been a mentor to me since I got involved with working on Burroughs almost 15 years ago. My first graduate thesis, Oliver was kind of remotely advising in various capacities. Reached out to him after I read The Secret of Fascination, and we've been colleagues and friends ever since. I think without Oliver's influence, there's a wide range of work that I never would have done, especially the kind of immersion in the archive that I was able to do during my PhD. Our conversation today is going to be pretty wide ranging. It's going to, I think, go back and forth over Oliver's biography as well as Burroughs's, and hopefully there's some complementarity or overlap between the two. It is now the 110th anniversary of Burroughs's birth, and we are conscious of the sense that he's both old and yet still very new. He really didn't die that long ago, some 30 years ago now, less. And that this kind of posthumous moment has led to an amazing production of scholarship that we'll be talking about, Oliver being the foremost producer of that scholarship, particularly as an editor, who I think has accomplished something somewhat unique in the history of literary editing. There are not many editors who have concentrated their work as closely as Oliver has to a single author, especially with as much investment in the idea of a kind of restored edition of works, of bringing out what was missing in the original publications by mining the archive, correcting history, etc. The title of our talk, Battle Instructions, is originating from one of the more recent books Oliver has published. I highly recommend everyone check it out if you haven't already. Whereas most of Oliver's restored editions of Burroughs' texts have involved taking a published work and republishing it in a new format, a revised format. This is a book that was never published before and brings to light a wide range of archival materials that, to me, are some of the most meaningful and interesting writings that Burroughs ever created. When I was working in my own archival research in the Berg, looking at the Travel Agency is on Fire, the collection of Burroughs cut-ups of other texts, I was really taken away by the style of Burroughs choosing to use capital letters when he was composing these kind of cut-up prose poems. And I spent a lot of time in the Berg transcribing these materials faithfully to the letter, right? Trying to preserve every error, every line break. And there's something about battle instructions in particular that they read as if they were designed to look exactly the way they do. And every little choice Burroughs made had some significance to what he was trying to communicate. But besides the archival origin, we're also really interested in this idea of battle instructions and of Burroughs's work as not just art, but manifesto, political statement, action, and his investment in providing future generations with, a manual, a how-to book of resistance to political oppression, expression of alternative identities, whatever it might be. And so today we're hoping to kind of talk a bit about that thread through Burroughs's work, with a focus on the present, what Burroughs can mean for us today, and also trying to provide for all of you a history of how we got here. I'm very excited to hear Oliver's story, and my own story. It started around 2010, 2008, but really took off with the centenary of Burroughs' birth in 2014. I was at the Graduate Center in New York and had the opportunity to host a large conference at the Graduate Center in tandem with other events happening both in New York and Indiana University. That work culminated in Cutting Up the Century, which brings together both conference presentations, revised essays, as well as archival research that I and other people were doing during that time period. And so when Oliver and I were talking about this interview, we were really thinking back to that moment, the 2014 centenary, and how it brought together scholars from a wide range of disciplines in a new and really meaningful way. It solidified for me a series of a kind of community of practice of welcoming Burroughs scholars who recognized the importance of his work and the Beats more generally, but also people who were aware of how much was still hidden under the iceberg of the published work. That includes people like Jed Birmingham, who I got to know at that time, has published a lot of work on realitystudio.org as well as elsewhere, uncovering Burroughs' publications in Little Mags. It included marked the occasion for Barry Miles' amazing biography of Burroughs, as well as, I think, one of the most pivotal moments in Oliver's career, the publication of the Nova trilogy, the cut-up trilogy of, not so much a trilogy of books that Burroughs wrote through the 60s and Oliver edited and revised in the mid-2000s to publish in around 2014. I remember seeing Oliver give a presentation at the Columbia University, because he had been doing a lot of research at the rare books there. And one of the things I hope we can shed a little light on today was his methodology. I was blown away by the way Oliver had developed systematic methods for tracking the variety of versions in Word documents, incredibly detailed comments for each iteration. I've never seen all of those materials, but I hope you have faithfully preserved them, Oliver, and they will be their own material for future scholars to mine. But to get us started, I think we should go back earlier than all of that and look a bit at how Oliver got started in this field, as well as, for me, The Secret of Fascination was really a pivotal book for not just understanding Burroughs, but understanding literary criticism today. I still think it's the most significant book on Burroughs. And that's not least because it provides a kind of port of entry into his work, theorizing the idea of fascination underlying his aesthetics, and the kind of drive that Burroughs inculcates in readers to try to discover some kind of secret or meaning behind the texts. My first essay that I wrote under, with a vision from Oliver, focused on the way Burroughs' early works implicate the reader to expect his novels like Junkie and Queer to confess deviant sexuality, that the reader can fit into a 1950s framework of the Lavender Scare and the Cold War culture of surveillance and containment, and then the way that those books, after inviting that kind of reading, resist it and disturb the reader in ways that you couldn't otherwise do if you didn't create in the reader a sense of fascination. Along with that, it was the beginning of, I think, some of Oliver's theorizing around genetic histories and archival research, and trying to get down to the facts of what Burroughs wrote when, and how his life and the things he encountered changed his thinking over time. So to enter into all of that, I wanted to start with the book that was published most recently by Oliver. If you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. It's called Two Assassins, published jointly with Farid Gadami, a Persian scholar who has translated Naked Lunch into Farsi. And one side covers Farid's exploration of Hassani Sabah, and the influence of that mythology on Burroughs. And then Oliver's essay explores what Hassani Sabah came to mean for Burroughs in quite elaborate detail. And along the way, Oliver writes in a way that I've never read him write before. It's much more of a memoir. If you read the book, you'll get a sense of how Oliver's own life has followed similar trajectories to Burroughs, and the points of intersection, sometimes very coincidental, that have led them to similar kinds of experiences and findings. Very early in the book, Oliver talks about meeting Farid and planning to go to Persia to explore the subject more. And he asks a question that I think a lot of us have probably found ourselves asking, just how did I get here? How did I end up in a situation that I'm now potentially traveling to Iran to study William Burroughs, of all people, right? Or the relationship between William Burroughs and other figures. And so I wanted to start by having you, Oliver, talk more about how you think about how you got here. Where you expected maybe to go back when you started your PhD and met Burroughs in the 80s, or how you make sense of how you've gotten here. And I just want to say it's the same thing I find myself asking, both in my work on Burroughs as well as all the other things I've gone to do afterwards, is I could never have really anticipated this. But if I hadn't worked on Burroughs, I don't think I would have gotten to do all the other things that I love that I do. So please take it away and kind of tell us how you rationalize the life you've lived.
Okay, thanks so much, Alex. I mean, I was taking a lot of notes on that because it was really interesting what you were saying. You covered so much ground that is really fascinating. And obviously, the question you really asked, how did I get here, is the question that we all ask. And from that point of view, although I'm very keen on this book, Two Assassins, it is quite personal. It's not about me. It's about our point of intersection with Burroughs and what that means to us. And that's something we instinctively know about our interest in a writer, but actually quite rarely do we experience someone sharing that in a way that perhaps is provocative, where you think, well, that wasn't my experience, but then what was my experience? How did I get here? So I think that's a very good opening question for us all. And one of the things that has kept me going in the Burroughs field for so long is the sense that in studying Burroughs, I'm learning about myself, as well as hopefully sharing knowledge about Burroughs. Just come back to a couple of things you said, Alex. One is that there were certain parallels between me and William Burroughs, apart from hat wearing, there really aren't any. I think the very first time I went over to Kansas to meet him back in '84, I felt like a fish out of effing water. I mean, Kansas in particular, I didn't get it at all. And, my assumption was this was a man I would never know. And in a sense, that's fine, because like I said in the preamble, I'm not a biographer. I don't want to try and get in someone else's head. And yet, one of the interesting aspects of Burroughs is that we do end up almost inevitably sharing and borrowing things that are very particular to him that then become our own. So there's this odd kind of transmigration of souls, or exchange of body parts, or electrons rubbing against each other. Some interaction is going on here. But in terms of where I started, you mentioned the landmark event 2014, the centenary, lots of great books, fantastic events, including the one that you organized in New York with a great lineup, Alex. It was great fun. But I'd already been working on Burroughs for 30 years by that time. You mentioned Secret Fascination, which it's got a backstory too, because that grew out of my PhD, which I didn't want to publish because it was so boring. And the reason it was so boring was because no one would supervise me in Oxford in 1984. They just wouldn't touch Burroughs. And the advice I got was, look, if you want to try and pass, just make it really dull, and people will not notice that you've written about Burroughs, and you'll get your PhD, and maybe if you then change tack, you could have a job. I didn't want a job, so I was quite happy carrying on with the book. But when it came to write Secret Fascination, I did want to put more of myself in it, and that's why fascination is not a good critical term in many ways. It's very ambivalent, very ambiguous, hard to define, and it's not thematic in the way that back in the day, the criticism on Burroughs that I knew was very thematic. It took Burroughs as a man of ideas. You mentioned his politics, his sexuality. Those were the main thematic and cultural interests in Burroughs, which of course are really important. If his ideas were boring, we wouldn't be interested. But one of the upshots of that kind of attention to his ideas was that no one was bothering too much about what he actually did, how he actually worked. And that lack of attention to detail about just how he made the text, how the texts were put together and published, was a real problem. And it became a problem as soon as I began doing archival work and just realizing that everything I knew was wrong. There weren't many sources out there, but the ones I'd read were just wrong. And the problem essentially is that if you mentioned textual scholarship and genetic theories, my position is there's no degree zero of materiality. All textual work has come from bits of paper, used to anyway, and typewriters, and in Burroughs' case, scissors and paste as well. So you can't ignore the material conditions. How important they are, you don't know till you look. And then, when I first went to it was the Rare Book Library in Columbia in '84, I just was seeing all this stuff, and it was just like, wow, this changes everything. So I suppose that I saw what I was doing was recognizing the need for scholarship. And I've been quite lucky that I didn't just put my scholarship to academic use, it went into editions, and that therefore put it in people's hands. But yeah, if your material base is shaky and in many cases wrong, you either interpret something wrong or you miss an opportunity to interpret. And I just give one very quick example of something, only because I just literally found it as a piece of paper on the floor. And it's not to do with my own work particularly, but I won't say where it's from, because I don't want to embarrass anyone. But I'll just read it out to you because it just struck me as being the kind of thing which used to drive me nuts. This is describing Paris, 1959, the discovery, invention of the cut-up method, which turned out to be quite an important part of my own work. Since the randomness of the resulting words interested Guyson somewhat, he happened to mention it to Burroughs. Now that makes it sound very casual, very passing, not very important. And until I looked in the archives and saw that Guyson actually had produced this really long manuscript, like 20-page manuscript, made out of hundreds of pieces of paper that he had cut from like dozens of newspaper articles that must have taken him days to put together. That's not something you happen to mention. That's not a casual thing at all. That was meticulous, that was deliberate, that was calculated. So instead of dismissing this as being just sort of happenstance that was amusing, once you realize it was very calculated, deliberate, there was a lot of effort, a lot of thought went into it, it's a different story. And, my immersion in editing is in every single case has produced that result. Every book I've worked on has been the most important book in the Burroughs canon for me, because each time I've come across this stuff, I've thought, wow, everything I knew was wrong. And if everything I know is wrong, and I spent 40 years doing this, then probably everybody else is wrong about it too. So there was that real drive to try and get the story right. And the way I phrased it, as you probably know, Alex, in Two Assassins, was that when I first met Burroughs back in '84, I was as green as the day was long. I mean, I knew even less then than I do now. I was very naive. I'd been brought up in a small town in England. I'd gone to Oxford, which had given me a lot of arrogance, but not much else. As for going over to America, I was really ill-equipped to meet William S. Burroughs. And I just, who was I to ask him questions and the rest of it? And then when I worked on my PhD and I sent it over to James Barholt, because I had a lot of unpublished material in it and I wanted it cleared, permission to use it. And then James wrote back literally by return of post saying, would you like to edit Burroughs' letters? And here's a big contract as well. I mean, it wasn't the money, obviously, it was the privilege of doing it. I just thought, well, this is a leap of faith. This is someone putting their trust in me. I'm going to repay that. I'm going to earn that faith in me, because I didn't really deserve it at that point. I felt the work I'd done probably quite good. I've always been a serious academic, but why me to do this work? Well, why me is the question you ask. How did I get here? Because I don't have the right qualifications. Everything about me, I'm short and I'm Jewish, I'm straight, what am I doing here? And in fact, James was very good on that. I can remember when I was doing the introduction to queer, and I wrote to him, I said, James, I've written this introduction, I think it's okay, but I don't really get the sexuality in the way that I think the book deserves. Would you just give it a good review, a good read, and just tell me if you think I've got something badly wrong, if I've missed stuff because that's not my field. And he wrote back a very, very tart, little curt email saying, didn't stop you writing the introduction to Junkie, did it? And of course he was right. I knew my place. I was not trying to be something I'm not. And because of that, I think the work I did had its validity. I wasn't trying to be an expert in queer literature. It's not who I am, any more than I am in junk literature either, if that's such a thing. So I've tried to sort of keep my place, which is as a scholar, and I think that sort of has been my kind of service to the profession, because I do feel that if you can change the base that people work with and on, and seeing Jim join us, he's somebody who knows all about this. If you can produce new information and new facts that change the picture, you open up so much more opportunity for interpretation than just being extremely clever. So that kind of legwork that you and I have done in the archives, that hadn't been done before. Seemingly nobody. I remember when I first met Miles in New York in November '84. He had literally been in Colombia just a few months earlier and found the Interzone manuscript, the text of Naked Lunch. So these things were still very fresh. Very little work had been done. So those missions, those raids into the archives really opened things up. So that was the kind of direction that I went in, and struck lucky, really. It could have been a dead end. The archives, access to archives is actually extremely difficult. It's much easier now than it was, but it was difficult. And also, you can spend an awful long time in the archive doing an awful lot of meticulous work and have very little to show for it. What's under the bonnet is not always of interest to people. So to make it of interest is itself a challenge. And I think one of the things that has been great in Burroughs studies is opening it up so that you don't have to be a specialist academic to get something out of it. I think that's really, really important. And having worn the hat for so many decades, I now can do what I want. And you mentioned Two Assassins. I feel I've given myself a license to be professional but personal, to be rigorous but engaged, to have that kind of point of intersection that I hope other people will think, wow, yeah, that's not my experience, but I can put my own experience in here, so that you're not operating on Burroughs like when you're operating with radioactive material through those big gloves. Not that I've ever done it, but you know what I mean. You're not at a distance from it. You're actually in the material. And damn it, one of the great things about Burroughs is that you get immersed in him, or really you're not in it to him at all. It's overwhelming. It's deeply funny, deeply offensive. It's not something that you just sort of pick over with a fork. What was the question, Alex? I'm not sure if I've answered it.
Yeah, no, I think you did. How did you get here? I think, partly what I really appreciate about the memoir style of the book is at this point you are a significant figure in the literary history of William Burroughs, and your travails and the history of what brought you there is equally relevant now. Your additions are what are influencing future generations of literary and artistic work, right, as well as scholarship. I did want to kind of go back to that moment when James offered you to edit the letters. Had you had any prior editorial experience? How did you learn to edit? You were always immersed in the archive, but editing is a very different task, and you take it to another level. You're the opposite of sloppy. And so how did you learn to edit, and how has your editorial style and approach changed over the years?
That's a very good question. That's why I said that this was a leap of faith. I think I've gone to one, maybe two lectures at Oxford on kind of textual theory. But back in the day, the default position at Oxford was to pass your PhD kind of training, you had to be able to decipher medieval secretary hand. Not much help when you're trying to decipher a Burroughs manuscript. So I had very little training at all. So yeah, it was the deep end. Also, this was the late 1980s, the very early 90s. This is pre-internet. So you couldn't just Google advice or support. Things were much slower in those days. I mean, I do feel incredibly antediluvian to be saying it, but you had to sort of know, you had to start somewhere that then led you to somewhere else. But it was a slow process. So just researching things like the footnotes for the letters was a really slow process. And in many cases, I had to just drop stuff because there's no way of finding out who to ask and so on. So the letters were tricky, but of course there was, apart from the issue of selection, and I made some mistakes in that. I think I left some important letters out. But apart from that, that wasn't really a big burden. It became a burden when I was changing a known text like Junkie, where I felt I had to justify my existence by changing things, but I had to respect the text and therefore change them only when absolutely necessary. So that's already a tension.
It's nerve-wracking.
That was really difficult. In terms of how things have changed, I feel I'm constantly inventing the wheel. Every time I do it, it's like, you know, when you set the internet up for the first time and you have to do all these kind of push buttons and you have to know all these passwords, and you leave it, and then 3 years later you change it and you haven't a clue what you did the first time. So it's a bit like that. And yet there's always an organic kind of process at the back of all the databases and the tables that I draw up. But every time I start with massive grids and all sorts of kind of notes and then tasks and things. And I do all that stuff, but I have a feeling it's just like foreplay. It's not really what I need to do. It's just sort of getting me there. And then at a certain point, I think, I've got it. I know what the story is. I've got a coherent story. Because editing is about making a story. It's not about a free-for-all. That's not editing. You know, you can post all the resources online and people could look at it, but what's the point of being a specialist if you can't make good judgment calls, if you can't say, no, that's actually not the story here. If it goes in at all, it goes in only as a kind of a note in the back. You don't put that in here. So you're having to kind of trust your own judgment that you're doing the right thing, which is difficult, a lot of responsibility. One of the great things that I said about the opportunity I've had is to tie my work to Burroughs's name, so that I smuggled in a lot of, material that people otherwise wouldn't have had. But it does also mean that if you get it wrong, it's going to be wrong for decades, because people are not going to re-edit these books. And they won't do it because it's an awful lot of work. And it doesn't pay that well either. I don't warn anybody. I'd come back to one point you made that was really interesting, Alex, when you said that what I'd done in terms of focusing on a single author is very unusual. I would compare it also to the situation with translations. And we have Théophile Ariès on the call here, who knows about this, having edited Burroughs himself. And one of the big issues in translation, and I can only speak for French, is that Burroughs has had different translators doing different books, and some of them have been very good and some have been very poor. But because it's been different people, there's a huge amount of inconsistency and variety where Burroughs is exactly the same. And as we know, if we know our Burroughs, he repeats with variations, and translations who then vary the repetitions lose that kind of base that he's referring to and changing all the time. So multiple translations really make it difficult to know what an author is like. I think I have been able to help the Burroughs just by a consistency of editing practice, quite useful. So I think that's been an advantage really to kind of present a kind of coherent picture. But at a certain point, it is subjective. I mean, you know that yourself from Lost and Found, which is a minor classic really, because it did present material that no one had seen. You did it meticulously with diplomatic reproduction. Great to see. But you had to make some choices because the length of the book and so on, and certain other constraints. I think the one thing that I've always tried to do is be as transparent as possible so that people could see what I've done. If I have a criticism, for example, of the restored naked lunch, is that no one knows what was done to it. I've gone through and I've marked up my copy against the other editions, but it's almost illegible because there's so many changes and it's hard to kind of follow what they really mean. And again, the problem with the devil being in the detail is that a lot of the details are actually quite boring. A lot of the details don't have the devil in them. So you have to wade through a huge amount of meticulous work to find something that you think, now that's actually quite significant. So it's a bit like being a CSI at a crime scene. You're doing forensic work, but you've no idea if this is blood or ketchup. And only at a later point does it turn out to be, this is the killer's blood. This is what you needed to know. So a lot of this work is, you'd have to be obsessive, I think, in order to justify doing it. There has to be a pleasure in the process because the end result is much less, I think, predictable than if you are a critic and you decided to study Burroughs from a certain angle, using Deleuze or looking at his representations of hotels or whatever it is. That is actually a much more pragmatic approach where you're in control of the material. And anything that you miss, who's to know? But when you're editing and you miss things, it's like presenting someone with a jigsaw and saying it's finished. And then people find later pieces of jigsaws and it turns out this was not the picture that you're giving the impression of. So editing is not for everyone. It's quite risky in that way.
Yeah, and I mean, there's something about editing Burroughs that is in its own way unique as well. And you were pushing against the kind of parallels between yourself and Burroughs, and maybe that's true at the level of personality or experience, but at the level of your methodology, it's clear you were influenced by Burroughs' cut-up method in your own, maybe it's just to match the form to the content of what you were working with, but, in Two Assassins, you have a photo of all your sheets of paper on the floor that look just like Naked Lunch's, or at least mythical depictions of Naked Lunch and the process of collaging those works together. I think partly the fascination with Burroughs and of editing his archive.
Yeah, you can see that. Yeah, that's what my floor looks like. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how you're saying you have nothing in common with Burroughs, but I think partly what is true is Burroughs's archives rewards intensive detective work. And one thing I think that's interesting, I work in the library. I'm very versed in libraries and archives, although I don't have an MLIS. A very common controversy in the library world is that some scholar comes along and says, I discovered this thing in the archive, right? And librarians probably already had cataloged it and had been sitting there and just no scholar had been paying attention to it. And I think that's true for a lot of important work. But with Burroughs, that is not really true, right? No one could have cataloged the 11,000 pages in the Berg. And so when you go there to mine the NYPL archive, you are discovering things that aren't in the catalog. So following kind of up on that, I was curious to just ask you if you've ever abandoned an editorial project, if there are any failures from your career, a project you wanted to edit something by Burroughs that you gave up on, or if each of these projects has really resulted in a completed work at the end.
Yeah, I guess they all have worked. I mean,
that's amazing.
In different ways, and I do have regrets about some mistakes I've made or judgments I'd have done differently. Of course, there's always a backstory, and I think the thing that I realized in editing was to re-experience in many ways the backstory to the original creation. So just as Burroughs was constantly having these battles with his editors who were saying, Bill, enough, you can't keep revising the manuscript. And they would say, we can't do this and we have to do that. So I was also finding the same thing with editors who were saying, we can't afford the font size. You're going to have a smaller font. Sorry, it's now too big. You're going to have to lose something. So that helped me understand, I think, the materiality of producing editions, which is something that you might know intellectually, but when you really experience it, you realize it's a problem. Just going back to sort of what it's like to work in the archives, I cheated on Burroughs once, and I went to Boston to the Hemingway archive, and that's because although 99% of my brain is preoccupied with Burroughs, 1% is occupied with other things, including Hemingway. And I went up to Boston. I took the Greyhound up and the Greyhound back in a single day. So I spent about 9 hours on the bus. I had about 45 minutes in the library, and that's all it needed. There was the box. I opened it. There was the manuscript. I looked at it. There were about 5 changes from the published text. I made a note of them, and I left.
Wow.
And I kind of normalized what it is to work in Burroughs. And you know what it's like in the days, especially in the New York Public, before you could go in and photograph stuff. Yeah, you were watching the clock. You didn't know how many days you could spend there. They brought out, literally, a single piece of paper at a time, and you have to look at it. That was the wrong piece. Go back and ask for call for another one. You were sitting there waiting, watching the time. Yeah. The pressure on you to work with incredibly difficult material, and again, because it's so repetitive, you don't know if you've read this before or not. I would definitely say that when I was editing the Cut Up trilogy in 2013-14, I was carrying it in my head. I had Nova Express, 3 editions of The Soft Machine, and 2 of Ticket Exploded in my head. And, well, I'm still here now, so the damage was not irreparable. But in a way, I did feel I was like an experimental subject. What happens if you totally immerse yourself in Burroughs' cut-up method for 2 years and do nothing else? What happens to your brain? We had some interesting discussions at the conference in Paris last September about the impact on your brain. David Holzer was doing a talk about this. And what happens to your brain on cut-ups is a very good question. Is it fundamentally different? Does it affect you? Well, of course, we know that reading is a stimulation. It produces material changes in your body. So that amount of it is going to have an impact, and it can be compared, I think, to music in some ways. I mean, music was my gateway drug into Burroughs, by the way, because back in the day in the 70s, I was the kid brother hanging out with older sisters who all were boyfriends and friends of band members who all they played music, they did drugs, and they liked William Burroughs. And not much of a musician, and my taste in drugs is soft, not hard. So all I had left was the Burroughs, which I ran with. But it was the badge of, I got into Burroughs for all the wrong reasons, or all the usual wrong reasons, the superficial ones in many ways. But the music scene, I think, was actually important for me getting into Burroughs, because that's where Burroughs had permeated. And although I think my own work has been not in that direction, I'm a scholar, not a cultural historian. Nevertheless, I do totally get that it fits together with other aspects of cultural practice, other experiences. And again, the memoir form was an attempt to kind of pull things together in a more organic and flexible way, whereas your standard academic essay or book, it's quite limiting. You internalize all sorts of limits on what's appropriate to bring in. And one question for you, Alex, is what your role as a dramaturge has meant to your interest in Burroughs, because you've had this really unusual engagement with Burroughs to put him on display in performance. Can you say something about that? Because that is really unusual and a great direction, I think, to take Burroughs in. Can you tell us how you got into that?
Yeah, I mean, it was fortuitous. I feel lucky to have had the opportunities I've had, and part of that was being in New York, where so much was happening around Burroughs. And I was going to say, I'll get to that question, but just to say, your reading of the cut-ups as an editor was still very different from how people probably normally read them, where you kind of let the words sweep over you. And I think partly what is impressive about what you've done is you've made a method out of his madness. You sought to actually trace the threads through those books and to come to some kind of facts about arguably some of the most difficult texts of the 20th century. Partly what I love about dramaturgical work and any kind of work where I'm adapting a text to some other medium to create some other work is it's incredibly freeing in comparison to scholarship. There isn't, the end goal is not that you get all the facts right. And so the backstory was really, I was working on organizing the conference and editing that anthology, The Travel Agency is on Fire. And James Ilgenfritz, who I connected with in New York, was interested in putting on a series of musical shows accompanying the conference and other events. And through that, we began talking about the travel agency pieces, and he worked with Experiments in Opera to adapt. Over 10 musicians performed those pieces. You can find them still online. And that was what led me eventually to be put in touch with, I think through you, Mallory Catlett, the director of Decoder. And when I encountered Decoder, it was another level. You can find some remnants of Decoder online, but I think there's still a lot that they are kind of cutting up and putting together videos and other edited editions that they can share online so people can watch the shows. But compared to, the Experiments in Opera were essentially a bunch of chamber music compositions in the very much experimental, electronic, and wide range instrumentals to adapt these very experimental cut-ups to music. Whereas the Decoder show, when I first saw it, they had already been working on it for a couple of years, and my immediate impression was, this is what I was imagining in my head when I read these books. The Decoder features both projections behind the performers, a performer who embodies Burroughs in many ways, Jim Finlay, and then G. Lucas Crane, a tape deck artist who was inspired by Burroughs when he was young to become a tape DJ, essentially. And so the show is really something special, where the actors and the musical instruments or the tape decks are connected through sensors, so that when Lucas cuts up the music, it cuts up the video. It's an incredibly complex machine they were creating. And I'd always been interested in these kind of cut up machines, even back in the 90s. When I first came across Burroughs, I was Googling cut up machines, and there were various things online even back then, far before the age of AI. But this Decoder was really not just a cut up machine of words, but of media. And all of the people working on the show were really invested in the idea of applying Burroughs' methods to contemporary media. I mean, we would have sessions where it would be like, let's cut up Mike Pence and put him inside like an asshole, and cut up his speeches in this very graphic way. And there was, I think, a real occult belief that we might achieve some voodoo-like effect on these evil people. And it would often be the case, oh, Tucker Carlson just lost his job. Maybe that's because we cut him up recently. So there was a real spirit that I think had come from Burroughs, and that we wanted to talk about today, which is, applying Burroughs, continuing his spirit on applying his methods, learning from his insights, to think about new ways of creating. I'm now working with a composer, Bernhard Lang, who's a very well-respected composer in Austria, who is also adapting The Travel Agency is on Fire. He's already done a performance of it, and they're going to be releasing multiple CDs of it. I don't know, that particular collection clearly, sold well with the musical world. And I think part of it is that sense of, very much, it's focused on how did Burroughs cut up other writers? And it invites a kind of sense of, well, how would I then work with that material? There's also, truthfully, less restrictions on the use of it compared to his most celebrated and published work, right? To adapt something like Naked Lunch to an opera is going to cost a ton of money, and it require a very complex permissions process. So there may be a certain work from the archive that is more amenable to adaptation. And certainly when I was in the archive, that was beyond my wildest dreams. I was sitting there transcribing this obscure cut up by Burroughs of Rimbaud. I never thought that, even James Ilgenfritz would want to adapt it to music, much less that it would lead to many more musical performances. And I hope for everyone else here that, you can feel inspired by that you don't know what the work you're doing could lead to. And I felt very compelled by that work. I was spending inordinate amount of time in the archive transcribing things and not having any good justification for all the work I was doing. And so there is something of like you kind of trace this in your work through to assassins of, you felt it compulsion to do certain things. You didn't necessarily know what it would lead to, but it's good you followed that compulsion or that interest. And yeah, so I partly want to bring it back to you by talking about that difference between restored editions and the new publications out of the archive, right? So you've published 10 volumes of restored books that were previously published, and then you've published battle instructions, which, similar to some of the work I've done, involves taking something from the archive that's never been seen before and making it presentable. And so there's the travel agency, but that's also what we did with Cutting Up the Century. I kind of took from all of my time in the archive a miscellaneous collection of what I thought would be the most interesting things to scholars, from like Burroughs cutting up Scientology to excerpts from Burroughs's Wild Boys pornographic screenplay. And we published elements of that throughout the book as kind of breather between scholarly, to make it more than just a series of scholarly essays. And something similar happened with Burroughs Unbound. Jed published some archival materials in there. I published the CUNY lectures that Burroughs gave on the virus. And then you published battle instructions, which I think should be paired with the travel agency.
We should plug that, by the way, for people who don't have it. It's a wonderful collection, Alex, but really, really good. Very solid looking good.
Yeah, and so maybe you can talk a bit about how you were thinking with battle instructions, how you approach that differently from your other edited work, and just how you would describe. I think maybe try to describe battle instructions to someone who doesn't know anything about it.
Yeah. Okay, I'll come to battle instructions in just a minute, because you said about 23 really interesting things beforehand.
Yeah.
One thing was the kind of theatrical productions you've been working on. So you've gone from the archives onto the stage, and the occult aspect. Wow. Back in the 70s, when I first picked up on Burroughs, as probably most people did in that era, it did feel a bit like being in a secret society. You knew other people knew Burroughs, but you didn't know who they were. This was obviously a long time before the internet, when you couldn't find people, but you knew someone was out there. I remember going to a party once in London, and somebody came up to me and said, "The guy over there knows about Burroughs." And it was like, scoring. That's what it was like. It was like, oh, I better go and see him. Or actually, I looked at him and thought, wow, he looks like a real creep. I'm keeping away from him. And then someone come up to you and say, what do you think about color symbolism in Burroughs? And it'd be sort of like, Masonic handshakes and things. It felt like Burroughs was our dirty little secret, which to some degree he really was, because, as I say, no one would supervise a PhD in Oxford on Burroughs in those days. It was just like, what was the point? It wouldn't do you any good. It wouldn't do him any good. This was at a day when the only book in English on Burroughs was by Eric Mottram. And although he actually examined my PhD, his book is very difficult and not very helpful. Apart from that, there were 2 books in French. A good one by Philip Mukiamos, kind of a general survey, and one by Serge Nunberg, which is a Lacanian study. That was it. So back in those days, there wasn't a lot to go on. So you did feel that you were part of an occult society. So the kind of conspiracy side of Burroughs made a lot of sense to me, because knowing Burroughs itself felt like being part of that conspiracy, that he had a counter view of the world. One of the problems we've got with the internet now is that you can go online and out Burroughs within 3 clicks. But back in the 70s and 80s, you had to be pretty committedly, mad to go further than Burroughs in terms of your conspiracies. You have to be quite dedicated and a specialist. You couldn't just go online and become obsessed with these things. But it just reminds me of some of the work we're doing with Davis, Alex, with editing Burroughs in Context, which is for Cambridge University Press. And we don't want to badmouth our publishers, but they are a UP, a very traditional UP. And their approach is, this is a writer in context. And one of the problems we have is with Burroughs is he may have 1 foot in being a writer, but he has at least 3 other feet not in being a writer. And his gravestone, American writer, really doesn't cover it. So the performative side is really important. The secret society side of it is important. Some of that is bullshit. Some of it is Burroughs as a disaffected insider who felt he wanted to be on the inside, hence his desire to be in the CIA and so on, the kind of fantasist in Burroughs. But that goes together very well with being someone deeply skeptical. And deep skepticism can take you in some dangerous places. And that's what Battle Instructions is. It's a dangerous place to go. And that's, of course, why I went there. I felt Burroughs deserved it. Those of you who haven't read Battle Instructions, it's pretty offensive in places, a lot of anti-Semitic material. And I felt, being a Jew as well as a Burroughsian, I was the only person who really could take this on without exposing themselves to real risk, actually. But it doesn't do Burroughs any justice to have the kind of Burroughs that will one day be on the shelf in every bookstore. It still pleases me that you can go into a bookstore and you can find your Kerouac and your Bukowski and your Bowles and so on. But you won't always find, there's Battle Instructions, Ugly Spirit Habit. You won't find Battle Instructions there. And although that's one of the downsides of being published by Moloko, and it's the only downside because Moloko is a fantastic press, that was the measure of Burroughs to me. So the ugly spirit, this is the message to himself: kick that ugly spirit habit, Burroughs. This is a message to himself in a letter from 1960, where he is aware of the ugliness within, and he's going to get it out. So confronting that material was a very calculated choice. It had been very much easier to have not done so. But I felt it was appropriate to take this on, not to sanitize Burroughs, and to face up to the challenge, really. How do we respond to this material? Do we take it as satire? You mentioned satire before, Alex, and your own excellent work on Naked Lunch and Imperialism and Decadence is about strategies of, throwing this back at the reader and the viewer, our complicity and so on. And of course, this is the problem. Instructions, you mentioned it's a manual, instructions suggest, okay, I take this, I follow it. Where's it going to take me? Well, if you look where it took Burroughs, it takes him into places that you wouldn't want to go into. So the ambivalence, the ambiguity, the danger goes together here with the desire to change things. So it's not a manual for us good liberals. The only I can compare it to, that's on a bigger scale and a more aggressive scale, would be Dan de Prima's Revolutionary Letters. And we've got Paulina amongst other people who know de Prima's work better than I do. But one of the reasons I loved de Prima's Revolutionary Letters is because they just pushed that envelope of, here's what you've got to do. You've got to blow up the power stations. You've got to blow up the schools. You've got to blow up the government. And this goes together with beautifully expressed, very clear-eyed views of the fantasy of living the life in the West that we do. That it isn't, that it's cost-free, that people aren't paying with their blood for us to have our comforts, that our big cars and fridges and the rest of it are not on the back of destroying the planet for the sake of it. So de Prima has a very similar kind of view in that particular text. Like I say, I'm not a de Prima expert. But I think Burroughs' work is relentlessly like that, not being sure where he stands. I have, vested interest. It's full disclosure. Burroughs is my man. 40 years locked up with him. So that makes it quite a challenge. Am I able to be objective about material that is objectionable? How to deal with it? So in Battle Instructions, I was getting this material out there, which I felt was important, and I was giving my take on it, but hoping that other people would take it in different directions. But it's certainly the most challenging material in terms of content. In terms of form, again, as you mentioned, Alex, it is, relentless block caps, and it just goes on and on and on for hundreds of pages, and it's being shouted at. It's that's hard. It's not as difficult as Minutes to Go, but then Minutes to Go is cryptic in a way that requires an electron microscope. That's a different kind of challenge. So yeah, I took the responsibility on to put this material out there, knowing that it wouldn't do Burroughs' reputation good in traditional ways, but feeling that this was who Burroughs was. He confronted the ugliness inside him. I tip my hat to that. I think it's we're so used to wanting to airbrush ourselves, to Photoshop ourselves to looking better than we are. Think of the difference between Burroughs and William Lee in Queer or The Age Letters. He takes the worst side of himself and makes it into a kind of bad joke, the ugly American. This is somebody who doesn't like himself. And from that point of view, yeah, he's a sad person. But I don't look to Burroughs as a role model, but I do look for some life lessons that airbrushing the world is not actually going to make it a better world. So confronting it is the way through. And I do think that he was very well aware of how his DNA was formed by his patrician class background. So he represented that stratum of American culture, which in a different way, it's true that in a different way, it's very much responsible for taking America in the directions it is, which is not the right directions. I'm not suggesting there's a list of other countries that have got the answer, but Burroughs was able to excoriate the ugly American because that's the person he was born to be. And he did his best to burn and dynamite the bridges, as we know. But it's easier to get out of America than it is to get the America out of Burroughs, as he found on his travels, which was the other story there. So I'm not sure if that answers all the questions about battle instructions. It was certainly a difficult text to work on for practical purposes. I think, Ben, I shared with you a big document. I don't know if you can share the screen on this, but I had to map all the manuscripts that I was going to select from to use. And one of the problems was that the material is often very similar, but there are certain, he might do 10 versions of the same page and so on. And it became a huge document. Okay, this is I think it's about a 40 or 50 page document you've got here. This is page 1. So, this is an attempt to describe the NW from Northwestern, the opening line and closing line, so I could kind of track it, then comparing it to other documents. Then have I transcribed it, what states it's in? And this goes on, I think it's for 50 pages, isn't it, Ben? How many pages is it? Goes on and on and on and on. And yeah, you have to cover this territory. And therefore you are really living with this. This is method acting. You end up feeling like you've written battle instructions rather than transcribed it. So it's a huge amount of material. And yes. It is therefore what I present is a selection, that there is more, but that's again a part of the editor's job is to make the choices. So there's a lot of work that goes on under the bonnet, and which a lot of it doesn't need to show. But as I say, in the editions, I've always wanted to document in the notes what I had done to the manuscripts, especially important with changing previously published text, obviously. But in this case, you can just see page after page of manuscripts and trying to compare them and collate them. And this is, all Hassan Sabbah. Yeah, a lot of Hassan Sabbah was in there, which is one of the stories that I suppose predisposed me to then work on Two Assassins, which was the book that came out last year. Though I wouldn't have done that if it hadn't been turning it over, if it hadn't been for Farid Ghanami, who, being a descendant of the Assassins, certainly took me in the right direction looking for Hassan Sabbah. So, yeah, so Burroughs has been taking me in some dark and dangerous places. So thank you for that. I don't know if there's much more you want me to say about battle instructions, is there, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, we should open up to Q&A in a little bit. I think two thoughts. One is, despite it being called battle instructions, despite Burroughs producing a lot of material that seems to be didactic, it's clear he resisted that urge, right? That he didn't write. The Boy Scouts manual is maybe the closest thing. He didn't write a lot of, revolutionary manuals for changing the world, right? And I think part of that was an awareness of the fact that it could be misused by the wrong people. And while, from my perspective, I want to believe that, yes, there's offensive material that gets produced through his writing, but that is part of both an exorcism process and a kind of aesthetics of confrontation that intends to disturb the reader more than, inculcate them with stereotypical ideas. But that similarly, he was aware, he tried to produce texts that, a good example of this is Nabokov in Ada, one of his late works. The book begins incredibly obscurely with like a kind of genealogy of Russian family history. And it's very hard to get into. And he said about it, I put that there so only people who are faithful readers would get to enjoy the paradise that comes after, And I think in a way, Burroughs practices that kind of veil of obscurity, that a certain type of reader is the only one who's going to learn the lessons he's trying to provide. And he didn't produce something that, his enemies could easily pick up and reuse for their own purposes, or at least that maybe that was part of his thinking. But looking at your Word document and just the amazing amount of work you've done as an editor, building your own databases, I think maybe we could talk briefly about aspirations around digital technology, right? You've produced these digital spreadsheets that are far more detailed than any catalog is about the Burroughs archive. And, I've been over time trying to build out a corpus of texts, and that includes just the materials that I transcribe from the archive, and other texts that I can find. But, I think there's a real hope in the future that scholars can work together. It's going to take great grant money, whatever, to build a digital archive of Burroughs' material that both allows it to be more discoverable, but also situates it, mediates it in a new way that's better testifies to what's there than a bunch of papers in a box. I don't know if you have thoughts on the kind of digital futures of Burroughs, but we could talk a bit about that and then maybe open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, definitely. I think the digital side of it's really interesting. I had a question from Joseph from the Czech Republic about this, asking about Cambridge Analytica, the kind of use of digital information and so on. I'm a bit at a loss to know how to respond, because my own work, to the extent that it's Burroughsian, is very analog based. I literally, I cover the floor with bits of paper and I have glue and scissors. And there's something about that materiality which I'm very comfortable with. So yeah, I have produced lots of digital databases, but I don't think I'm the right person to know how to use them. And I suspect, the extraordinary thing about Burroughs's archive and the way he used it was that he got kind of digital results from analog methods, which is also kind of parallel to the way he got artistic results from kind of political and technical, logical kind of interest. And they kind of, it's quite special what he did. I think you're definitely more qualified to speak to that, but I'd like to ask you to speak in the two dimensions. One is an archive of material to make it available. The other is an archive that is in action, because I think this is one of the themes that we wanted Battle Instructions to cover, which is the idea that, unlike most writers, you don't just read Burroughs, you somehow, the engagement needs to require you to do something else. So where does it go next? I think this is the element about spilling off the page that he talked about in Naked Lunch. It's the element that, although I think Geisen didn't like Burroughs saying it, when when Burroughs was talking about cut-ups, he would say you walk down the street, you're thinking of, you know, Mexico, and all of a sudden you see a Frida Kahlo painting go by or something in the street. And then Burroughs would say, you know, that's a cut-up. And Geisman thinks this was nonsense. But actually, I think Geisman was wrong on this. I think actually it's that point of intersection between you and the contingent circumstances that really interested Burroughs. And I suspect one of the reasons for it is one of the most problematic sides of Burroughs, which is this is a way of recreating the world through yourself as the point of intersection. I think I say it's problematic because community, which I think most of us would agree is actually one of the antidotes to the capitalist order that's destroying the planet, community surely requires a shared vision. So I think there's a really difficult tension here, just as a matter of big principle, between having a shared consensus view that allows us to work together and Burroughs's fascination with this is something meaningful for you because of your personal associations. But I do think that element of taking it out of the book and into the streets is really important. You know, it's like when you go to a gig and you come out and you're pumping with it. The music doesn't stop at that point. It's sort of, I don't go to many gigs, but I'll tell you one I did go to, which was kind of very appropriate. This was in Lawrence, Kansas, and James took me to see Ministry on their New World Order tour. They were really good, and we had fun with Al Jorgensen on the tour bus afterwards. I can tell you, he's quite a character. But the music and the light show was just really pulsating and heavy, and I'm not into heavy rock, so for me it was like, you know, particularly exciting. But I remember coming out and just feeling I could just kick the wall down. And I think that sense of empowerment in another way is something that you should get from Burroughs. I think there's a strong nostalgic and elegiac element to him. There's a ghost trapped in the machine of his work and so on. There's a person in there, a sad, suffering person. But there's also a degree of it shades into being a vigilante, and that's the danger of it. But an element of, I'm just not taking this anymore. Yes, look at the world, you know, and so on. So I think that aspect of his work that's so confrontational, whether it's in form or in content, is something that leads you to want to take it and run with it. And I think it's no coincidence that so many people have adapted to film, to music, to art and other media. It's no coincidence at all that he's inspired them to do something with it, not just to like Burroughs. You know, there's lots of writers I like, but they stay on the shelf. And for better or worse, you know, Burroughs is kind of, I'm wearing the t-shirt, he's behind me on the wall, he's over here. You know, I'm not saying he's improved my life necessarily, but he's given me tools for thinking and for responding. And I want to share the inspirational side of him, which is a problematic side as well. And as I said at the beginning, I got into Burroughs for the wrong reasons, the superficial reasons of he was cool as an icon. And it is possible to fetishize Burroughs, to have, one of his methadone bottles on your desk and think, oh, I've got something special. Or even better, to have a piece of his house. Now, I should clarify, I did not steal this. This was given to me in 2009 by TP. So this is not stolen property. But, I don't think I actually fetishize Burroughs. I think I try very hard to do his work justice, which means also confronting the challenges of his work rather than always wanting to champion him in some way. I think it's more problematic than that. I think taking on somebody risky is, for me, the second best, because I'm not a risky person. I'm a very risk-averse person. I'm happy behind my desk. I'm happy living in a small town. So I get my kicks, via Burroughs in that way. But I admire somebody who took those risks and who exposed himself through taking those risks. And not just in his life, they were in his work. He's not alone in that, obviously, but very few other people take the same risks and are as funny.
Yeah, no, I think that relates to, you brought up community, and I think it's deeply relevant. Burroughs is often described as someone who was alien, didn't have community, was exiled from America, maybe never expected to come back. And I think that freed him to write things that no one else would. But it's not like he ever stopped thinking community was important and dreaming of it, right? And writing utopias about communities that could be better than the ones we have. But his critical perspective was one that essentially thought community wasn't any longer possible, right? Or the type of community that he would want. Maybe the Cold War kind of white hegemony was possible. But so this idea of community, it's something that we shouldn't lose with Burroughs. And I think we're a community that he has spawned, among others. And there's a lot in his writing that can help guide how we think about community. And that is partly what interests me about the digital as well, is the potential to connect scholars around materials that otherwise are almost impossible to access. I think the other thing about the digital when it comes to Burroughs, every author deserves a digital archive, sure. But Burroughs is particularly well suited to that kind of project, both because he was so critical of media and certainly anticipated the kinds of problems we have today. I can imagine that he would still have a flip phone if he were alive today, right? Like, I can't imagine him with a smartphone, at least just out of fear of the surveillance, right? And his investment in critiquing digital technology nevertheless also involved experiments with every type of media he could find, more so analog, but often meditating on what digital technology would bring. And to me, his cut-up methods are types of algorithmic processing of material, very similar to more computational methods around now. And so I think, yeah, you're right to bring up this idea of, well, there's both the archive of materials, which could be made accessible in digital format in a new way that would allow us to search and count his texts and see how one text led to another and where does a specific phrase first appear. All of that could become possible. But also we could have something much better than those 1990s web cut-up machines that still exist, right? But that would be something different than what we're seeing today around generative AI. A Burroughsian generative AI would you would hope not end up mimicking something like a Latta, right? And they could launch the kind of machine that imitates you and then causes you to go into some kind of crisis. I think that there's a space there to imagine, what does a Burroughsian modeling software look like? Would it be possible to replicate Burroughs's cut-up methods through digital technology? Would there be ways to make it easier for people to learn how to do cut-ups with other types of media? That kind of question, I think, is still very open-ended. And, the alternative, as Burroughs knew, is to just let, Elon Musk develop our AI models, right? So I think there's a lot of potential there. There's obviously issues around copyright, and that's actually one of the areas that I'm really invested in right now, is how do we provide frameworks for people to work with copyrighted materials to make them accessible in various formats online or otherwise. But for now, I think there's really a challenge for scholars to just be thinking about that, be theorizing it, and recognize that, like your work, for instance, you have created incredible digital artifacts. That 53-page spreadsheet is a database that if you don't do it, someone else will use it later, as long as you make it available, and it'll provide a kind of blueprint to Burroughs's work, and allow for versions of a text like this to be made available online in a new way. And I would like to think that doing that would also empower people to take things off the page and give them a new life, the way you described. I don't know. It's a very exciting time. I think in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a huge shift in Burroughs scholarship, largely thanks to you, both providing a foundation for, Decoder. We depended on the restored editions, for so much of our attempts to make sense of these books. And I think there's so much more we can expect to arise in the coming years, adapting Burroughs's work, publishing things that haven't been seen, yeah, maybe there will be restored editions, especially that probably is in the order for something like Naked Lunch, you know, a digital critical edition of Naked Lunch. It could be a 10-year project, but it could be incredible. And I think that, you know, that it inevitably leads to a kind of community. You know, Burroughs, more than most writers, was not writing alone. He was collaborating with other people. He was cutting up their work. He was writing to people constantly. And so when I imagine an archive, I don't imagine it as just a kind of Burroughsian archive that, you know, Kerouac's going to be in there, Geison's going to be in there, 20 other different important figures' work are going to be in there. And understanding how those influences fed through his work, you know, in ways that we can't currently, will be incredibly powerful. I'm working on a essay for a volume that Joan Hawkins is editing called Wounded Galaxies, and I've been tracing back through Burroughs's work, you know, occurrences of that phrase. And you know, it's still only something we can speculate. What sci-fi books or magazines did Burroughs cut up to come to that phrase, or where did it first originate? But there is a way we could trace at least some elements of its, you know, its first origins, as well as, you know, even identify at some point which books he was cutting up at that time. So yeah, I think there's a lot we could say. I do want to open it up to Q&A, but did you have anything more you wanted to reflect on?
Yeah, I just point out there seem to be 23 of us on this call at the moment, a good Burroughsian number. I think the community side of it is really important. It is, as I say, sort of, it's not a reading club, but it's off the page. I would mention that Klaus Makers is in Mexico City celebrating Burroughs' birthday with cinema event, film screenings. The film side of Burroughs is, again, an important dimension we've hardly touched on. We're hoping that Luca Guadagnino's version of Queer will come out later this year. We'll see what that's like. So that element of events and, you know, sharing in a community, I think that's something that goes very well together with the EBSN, which again has been, I think, a very successful attempt. I tip my hat to Paulina for first suggesting it all those years ago, just to bring people together who had intersecting interests, but weren't necessarily just a bunch of academics, but could overlap. And it would help academics be less academic in the pejorative sense, while retaining the best of being an academic, which is about taking things seriously and being meticulous, hopefully, and rigorous. But those events are really important. Sense of community, it's important. Reality Studio, which you've mentioned about Jed, but also Keith, who runs it. Again, it's a Burroughs community. And that's actually, again, my experience of the Paris conference, collapsed at 2023. A great community of people who came from all over the world, you know, to be together, to share as collectors and publishers and musicians and painters and poets. You know, several of you on this call were there, so you know, and translators, and yeah, it's fantastic. It's because I think we're learning from each other's specialisms and interests and overlapping. Now that may be true of many societies, many groups, and so on. But I think, you know, there is something particular about Burroughs, which is, I think, quite challenging. This is not an easy fanzine kind of, you know, collective here. We know that there's something in Burroughs which is going to be pushing us constantly and challenging us, and I think we want that. I don't think Burroughs wants us to be confident and certain in our beliefs. I think we need to be challenged in them, and that requires pushing as well. So we will go with that. A quick shout out for other titles from Moloko. James Grauholtz's classic study of what really happened when Burroughs shot Joan. A copy of my own things, but also Thomas Antonich's excellent book on Burroughs in Vienna, and another big volume, Stan Gontarski's Burroughs Unbound. Because as you said, there's been a lot of really interesting work done recently, and there'll be more to come. And I think that, you know, what I'm really hoping for is that this work will just shed light on neglected aspects of Burroughs, of course, but also will be we'll take a few risks. I go back to a quotation which I picked up many years ago, and I believed at the time, which is, the study of water need not itself be wet. But actually, I think my own work has got quite damp, and I think it's because Burroughs has taught me that actually, if you internalize the discipline, then you can only see what you allow yourself to see. And speaking for myself, I have a very large blind spot, which means I see what I expect to see, and I can't see other things. So one of the main uses of Burroughs for me has been to take another look, to see what I didn't see. And that's one reason why I've looked in for the devil in the detail. But you can apply that in other ways. You don't have to be a scholar, obviously, in that way. But I think that's one of the great values of Burroughs, is to sort of force us to look again. Yeah, quite right. We do need questions throwing at us.
One other thing, real quick, I'll just plug our book, William Burroughs in Context, which will be coming out in a couple of years. Will hopefully showcase more of the community of scholars working on Burroughs. And then another thing to look forward to that Oliver and I have just briefly talked about so far is that the 50th anniversary of the NOVA convention will be coming up 2028, which is generously far enough away we can actually plan for it calmly. But that's going to be a pivotal moment. The NOVA convention was that kind of moment when Burroughs became known as an important figure in critical theory, and it was when he reached his kind of ultimate level of a spokesperson and more than just a fiction writer. And it also kind of cemented his status at the center of a community. And so I hope that there will be a lot of events organized around the NOVA convention, as it fits well with the William S. Burroughs in Context series as a kind of moment to reflect on what was the context that Burroughs was a part of and that he created, right? That he influenced. So with that, let's turn it over to some questions. I saw a couple raised hands, but I don't see everyone on screen. So if Ben, can you call on people? Or
Yeah, I think Alexander Greifenstern raised his hand. So Alexander, you can turn your mic on and you can ask a question or type it in the chat box, whatever.
Hi, yeah. I actually raised my hand by accident, but there just came up a question. Do you think there can be? Is there material from the NOVA convention? There was a very a great double book on the schizoanalysis convention by Semiotics. Is something like that possible for the NOVA convention?
It's a great idea. That double volume set is quite something, isn't it? Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. And as Alex said, it's far enough away for us to sort of start hatching plans. And I think Alex is right. Sort of the intellectual reception of Burroughs, but also the kind of the cultural scene in New York coincided there. Yeah, French intellectuals, downtown New York. There's a lot going on at that particular moment. And I think you're quite right, Alex. That is a great landmark. So I think, Alexander, yes. I suspect that we will kind of keep each other in the loop on this, because I think a lot of people would like to be involved. So yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah, it's also when Burroughs gave the speech about essentially, environmental catastrophe, but, talking about if someone's poking holes in the raft, we have to do something about them. And obviously we have not. And 50 years later, when we go back to what he said in 1978, I think around the time that Exxon already knew, right, that global warming was going to be coming down the pipeline, there will be a lot to talk about around that. But I love the idea of, a book, and maybe bringing in some of the same people who are involved in those other books in the original convention.
Yeah, I think also that the difference that we could make in a few years' time is that we can have events in the city, for example. It makes good sense. But these can also be, streamed events and online to reach, many more people. And I think that's the other thing that, it has more reach now. So we can do more with it in that way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Yeah, thanks for raising this, Alexander.
Yeah, it would be great too to have scholars come and speak about the other people who are at the NOVA convention. A Deleuze scholar speaking about Burroughs and Deleuze, or could be a much more multidisciplinary event.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure. Jim said hi in the chat box. Jim, did you wanna weigh in and ask a question, make a comment? I think Jim has dropped off. Oh, there you are. Hello.
No.
I can't hear him there. Well, does anyone else have a question? Well, if not, oh yeah, there we go.
Go, Nina.
Go for it.
Yeah. Well, there was a question that I was never able to answer because, you see, when I interviewed Bill, it was in 1981, and then the interview ended in a sort of compendium of the ultimate Burroughs interviews that are published by Semiotext. You remember that one? He said I wanted to ask him about his wanderings and how did he feel when he went back to the US and how he lived in England. And he said, oh, England was a terrible country to live in. I hated it. But he never, I asked why, and he said, oh, please, like he wouldn't even comment. He wouldn't. Why would he keep such a negative attitude? Is that something that Oliver might have tried to answer?
Great question.
It's a very good question, but it reminds me of his response when he left Paris in April 1960, just after publication, A Minute to Go. And he wrote immediately to Brian Geisen saying, the best thing I ever did was getting out of Paris. London is so much better than Paris. I'll get out of Paris. Hated it. Never liked it. So
yes, I couldn't agree more with him.
So, but I think that his investment in places is a really interesting question. In fact, that's not really been addressed completely. I mean, obviously, Miles' big biography is great in setting the scenes in different places, but it is a bit of a mystery quite why Burroughs bonded with a place and then disowned it so much.
Yes.
So his violence of his attitude it's not surprising. He gets to London and he loves the fact that he can get his good meals for cheap or something, and whatever. He likes the Empress Hotel, which is this crappy ordinary hotel in a rather sort of decrepit part of Fulham. There's nothing really going for it at all. So I'm not sure he's a great tour guide to places and where to live. I mean, he might tell you where to score, but I'm not really sure his quality of life index was one of his strengths, really. So, his judgments on places and people could be, quite harsh. I never met a Dane who wasn't bone dull. I mean, he doesn't hold back, does he? So I think his responses are partly pragmatic in terms of how far the money goes, but I think also a certain element of drama, a bit of a drama queen, perhaps, in terms of how he loves and hates places. He seemed very comfortable in Kansas, I have to say. More comfortable than I was, but
I think one of the threads that runs through his work, especially the way he talks about 1920s St. Louis, right, is this nostalgia for a place when it used to be great. And I think for him, a lot of the places he ended up, maybe he was there for a sweet spot, but then he also saw it fall apart, and we all, I think, are now familiar with that. Everyone I ever know from New York talks about how it was great before, right? And there's something true to that. And I think that's a lot of what his work is kind of mourning, is the loss of place to time and capitalism and what have you. I remember there's a note that I came across in the Berg archive. I'm pretty sure I emailed it to you and other people all over at the time. I'm going to have to paraphrase, but it was something like, there's nowhere left in the world to travel to. We'll just have to make our own fun, you know. And I think that he did get to a point where he felt that way. And you know, New York didn't really work out for him when he came back to the US, and maybe he liked it, but also it wasn't sustainable. And you know, Kansas was both a place he might have been happy, but also just a nowhere that he could be at, that he could make his own fun.
Yeah.
Oh,
Very well put, Alex. Yeah, I think you're right on that. Good one.
thank you anyways. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Jim Pennington has re-entered the room. Jim, if you wanted to ask a question, now's your chance.
Microphone. No,
Yay.
I did it by mistake again. I just wanted to make sure that I could see what other people were talking about, because actually I have to say I'm a little bit out of my depth here, because people talk such detail and make so many assumptions that yeah, I'm not there anymore. I've been Burroughs-Crucian, actually, I'm told is the real word, for so many years that one forgets that there is something very Freemasonic about Burroughs and this little grouping. 23 of us. I mean, for God's sake, what's going on? Yeah, I've heard some wonderful things this session, and I'll tell you what I'm looking forward to is to how they are going to do the queer film coming up later on this year, and I don't know what involvement James Grauholtz has with it, or whether it's just coming from a completely sort of different area. And these are areas we don't actually know about. I say we. Burroughs seems to exist in some extraordinary places that we don't know about, and that's what I think so great about him, actually.
Yeah,
I've said enough.
Yeah, okay. Just in terms of queer, if you can see this, but this is a screenshot of me with Daniel Craig and Luca Guadagnino.
Oh, come on!
Wow.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to get a bit of input into the film. What they took from me, I don't know, because after I gave my 20-page critique of the script, I didn't hear back from the director. So he might have hated what I said. But I had a nice chat with Daniel Craig. He was lovely, I have to say.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Who knows? I mean, you know, with films, there's so many ways it can go wrong as well as right. So I'm. Listen, if I get tickets to premiere in Cannes, I won't complain. But if I don't, and the film isn't very good, then I'll probably write something bitchy. Who knows? But it's, you know, it's been a while coming. As you know, there was talk about a film of queer for a long time, and I think Junkie would make a great little film as well. But I can't comment on James's involvement in these things. But yeah, there will be new projects. James Bond Burroughs, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we will see. I'm looking forward to it, I have to say, because I didn't watch Daniel Craig in the James Bond movies. It's not my style of film, really. But then I saw him playing the rather camp, over-the-top roles in his recent, more detective films and so on, and realized he's actually capable of being very funny in a very over-the-top way, which I think is also one way of understanding Lee in Queer. I have to say, I read Queer for quite a while and just found it very disturbing. And it was only when I was actually staying in Lawrence, actually, with James, so years after Burroughs had died, and after some of the local Green stuff, I reread Queer, and I actually hurt myself laughing. It was the first time I realized it's a hysterically funny book. It's just very painful as well. So the adaptation could go in different directions. yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing. But as long as it's funny, I don't care. I mean, as long as it's not Cronenberg's Naked Lunch and lots of brown, I don't mind that again. But we'll see. We'll see, Jim.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm thinking it would have been nice if they'd cast the person who played Harry Potter in a role in there, because that would have introduced, because these actors, they carry with them their previous roles, and that bloke, his name is Daniel or something, I think he would have carried with him a sense of magic and ludicrousness, and actually even the kind of wild boy in the public school thing that maybe would have done the queer thing.
He wasn't too bad in Kill Your Darlings. I have to say.
He was brilliant. Absolutely, fucking brilliant.
Yeah. But I think that's the trick, isn't it?
He couldn't have played Burroughs there. He played the Ginsberg brilliantly. In fact, he would have played. He would have played in Queer Allerton. Yeah. Perfect. Thanks. Lovely.
Yeah. But we'll see. I just hope it's funny, because I think it needs to be a kind of excruciating humor. And we'll see. I mean, Luca Guadagnino has done some great films, not just Call Me by Your Name as a kind of queer story, but also Suspiria. I don't know if you know his remake of the Italian film Suspiria, which is really weird. Peter Weller has aged out. Yeah, he certainly has, Paul. I think also Peter Weller, although I quite liked his look, his deadpan monotone did not play up the exaggeration of Lee as a performer. And I do think that Lee is an interesting persona of Burroughs because it's so performative, and it just reminds me so much of frankly myself. I'm a very shy person who pretends to be a performer, and I can see the same dynamic in Lee, as somebody who is actually cracking up and in a terrible place, but projecting outwards like crazy. Ben Foster, I absolutely agree, Teo. I think Ben Foster was really good. I mean, his entrance when he's lying in a bath with a gas mask on, I mean, there's no historical accuracy or fidelity there, but that's what you want from a film. You want something to sort of make you, to laugh and think that's a really good Burroughsian kind of joke, not, oh, that's the joke Burroughs told. Anyone can do that. But I think you're right.
That's interesting. Cillian Murphy. It's not a bad point.
Yeah.
I mean, I think queer is going to be tough. It's such just the acting alone. You both have to play incredibly wounded, desperate, forlorn lover character / withdrawing addict / like ugly American making a fool of himself in the bar, saying obscene things, and there's such a range there that both in the directing and in the acting, it's going to take a lot to cover, to both kind of capture the pathos and the humor of that book. But the scenes, the setting, the characters, the plot, it could be an amazing movie. Oliver and I have also talked about, there were rumors of Gaspar Noé directing Soft Machine. It seems not likely to actually be true, but hopefully there are more cinematic adaptations of Burroughs' work.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, they help Burroughs reach parts that his books just can't reach. But it's not always to the advantage. I mean, I know some people do like Cronenberg's Naked Lunch, or despite being a Cronenberg fan, I really did not like it.
Yeah.
I can remember going to see it with my good friend Ian McFadden, and we went in such high spirits. We were just intoxicated, the combination of Burroughs and Cronenberg, and we just came out in silence. It was just like, Jesus, we didn't laugh. How can you not laugh at Naked Lunch? It may be an uncomfortable humor, but if you're not laughing at it, there's something badly wrong. So plenty of scope for losing the plot or losing the humor.
Right. I mean, Burroughs is a very cinematic writer, but no one has taken advantage of that aspect of his writing.
Well, I think you probably find the Burroughsian quality in cinema in other ways, don't you? And yeah, just bear in mind how back in the day, Hollywood films in the 40s and 50s that around Burroughs' time, but just the cutting speed was so slow that the tricks you could do were so limited. I mean, the opportunities now, everything is Burroughsian in ways that they could have been, but Cronenberg's version is a vision. Yeah. Maxwell, Buster Keaton. yeah, some good references to humor. And also W.C. Fields and so on. I mean, people have written about humor a little bit in Burroughs. Catherine Strope has, but there's a lot more to say about it. And there's also a lot more laughs in Burroughs. Let's not forget the laughs. But we're coming towards the end of the show. So does anybody else have a particular point or question that they'd like to throw at myself or Alex?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in, even though I'm part of the crew here. Can I just ask about like the popularity of Burroughs? Because we're talking about there being movie versions of his work, and I feel we always, I think I speak maybe on behalf of everyone, we all come at Burroughs as like both fans and scholars, and I think that is a kind of slightly troubling and slightly difficult position to be in. And like thinking about Burroughs in terms of wider popular culture, it's quite hard to kind of see that positioning and see where Burroughs is in popular culture. I just wondered, kind of, do you feel that that Burroughs' popularity is increasing, or if it's been waning, and why is it that there is constantly a kind of talk about a Burroughs movie, and he's kind of on the edges of being kind of maybe part of the mainstream? And I just wondered what your thoughts were about that.
It's a very good question, Ben, isn't it? Where do we get our sense of someone's place on a curve up and down? I think it can be very misleading. I can remember back when I first was into Burroughs back in the early 1980s, someone coming up to me and talking about Burroughs and just saying they had no idea that he wasn't the biggest writer in America. And it was like, it shocked him to realize that very few people actually knew of Burroughs and that he was absolutely persona non grata in academia. So I remember thinking about it and at the time thinking, well, where does he stand? And at that time, I came at him partly through the beat context, which again was a kind of coterie kind of interest, which cut across academia but wasn't part of academia. So it was difficult to gauge really where he stood. I've had the sense at times of Burroughs as being, striding the universe. 2014, Alex, we're going to be landmark events. Your event in the Graduate Center in New York, trip I took to Indiana, which was a hell of a ride, and events in London and Tangier. It just felt like, this was Burroughs' century. Cutting up the Burroughs century. It really felt like a coincidence of Burroughs and the timeliness of it was great. But these things come and go, and it can be strange things that make them topical. But we've barely touched on some of the big topical issues in terms of conspiracies, viruses, technology, the paranoia, which looked like madness, but now just looks like normality, and so on. All sorts of aspects of Burroughs which fit in with our age in a way that other writers, for better or ill, they don't reach those parts. So cool or uncool, too dangerous to fit. Yeah, I mean, hopefully, yes, that's the Burroughs we want, isn't it? Someone who, doesn't completely fit. But Alex, what's your take on where he is?
Yeah, I mean, it would be fascinating to see book sales and how they've changed over time. And I mean, I wonder even just to know more about the book sales for your restored editions, which were produced through Popular Presses. Popular means something, I don't know, different now. So I was amazed by how many musicians, adored Burroughs and, wanted to work on his most obscure cut-ups. So I think there's a popularity to Burroughs in circles, avant-garde circles especially, that is not appreciated outside of those circles. There's also the European appreciation of Burroughs versus the American. I think there's a kind of hesitancy or shame of Burroughs in America, and a lot of the beats, whereas they are beloved over the pond. There's certain canonical things that maybe haven't happened with Burroughs. There's not a Library of America edition of his books, but also, like you said, he's far more than just his books, and on that level, I think his popularity is very mainstream. It's just a mythical version of him that depends as much on the controversial things about him as anything that he actually did. I think that the movie adaptations and other kinds of modern readaptations or rewritings of Burroughs are the biggest thing that will determine if he remains or becomes more popular in the future. I agree with Jim that he's too dangerous to fit in a lot of ways, but also some of the things that are controversial about him will become less controversial, especially drug use. And he may, become celebrated for things that people were scared to celebrate about him before. His misogyny, I think, is the biggest issue with his kind of popularity today, and obviously the murder of his wife. But at the same time, he deeply challenged gender binaries in ways that I hope will be analyzed in new ways in the future, and was one of the early writers to do that, I think, in a lot of his works. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. I think I hesitate to say many writers are popular the way we would like. But there's definitely kind of a post-war American group of writers, from someone like Cormac McCarthy to Pynchon, who I think all will see a rise in, McCarthy's at another level of fame, but that they will continue to rise in popularity over the coming years, and that Burroughs will always be in that mix.
Yeah, good point. Depends on the language we use, fame or notoriety. I think the internet is the real problem here, because you're right. I always come across little comments on the internet. Oh, do you hear about Burroughs? He killed his wife, nasty man. What a piece of shit. People make such incredibly reductive and drastic comments based on very little knowledge, which really traduces him. But you can see how that's the way the internet works in terms of instant responses. But it also works in the way of disseminating. And in one of the more tricky section titles in To Assassins, which I will plug, called Metempsychosis as Intertextuality, I try and argue that the way that Hassan Sabbah as a figure has kind of gone down the ages is precisely through being reinvented, whether it's by Shelley, who wrote a story about the assassins, or through the way he's taken up by the Club des Assassins in Paris, and so on. So that it becomes a kind of meme that passes through other writers. And I think Burroughs does that because he turns up in all these places. I can always remember my eldest daughter, when she was as a teenager, very into Warhol, and would have nothing to do with Burroughs. And she came marching into my office one day and brandishing Warhol's diaries and threw them at me and said, "Oh God, he's in here as well, isn't he?" And I like that sense that he will keep turning up, even if you can't find him on the bookshelves, along, as I say, with Kerouac, who is much more easily domesticated. But I think a bit like Ginsberg, I think Burroughs was collaborating as a way of disseminating his seed. That's what writers do, isn't it? You want to be remembered. You want people to pick up on your phrases because it's a tag for the more interesting stuff. I mean, Burroughs's phrases are what stay in the imagination. They stick in your head. But these refrains are just the tags to the more interesting stuff, the more important stuff. Getting stuck in your head is the first thing. He had worked in advertising, as I Ginsberg, but those knew their tricks. Getting the song stuck in your head, so the refrain goes round and round. But you want it to be carrying the message of something more substantial, and in Burroughs' case, there certainly is. So domesticating Burroughs, no, it's not going to happen. I don't think, is it? Right. Well, I think we've burnt up our time, and I'd just like to say a big thank you to Ben, especially behind the scenes, for setting up the Talking Beat series and for being tech man on the EBSN. The EBSN is a labour of love. We don't pay ourselves to do this, but we enjoy it. It's a great chance to share what we love and to be a part of the community with such really interesting people as you guys on here tonight. So we're really grateful for that. And it's lovely to, if not interact with everyone, at least to sort of see familiar names and new ones as well. And a big thank you to Alex, because it's been a pleasure being a colleague and a friend of yours so far. You've been great to work with, and I really admire your work. So it's been fun.
Thank you, ditto, and it's been an honor to get to interview you after learning so much from you over the years.